Couple just remarks and notes before we get started, and I think most importantly, I wanted to recognize that the lands that we're on now are ancestral lands of the Grand Ronde and the Chinook Nation, which is a really important thing that we wanted to make sure we started out with. So yes, that also deserves significant recognition with this and any exhibition. I also want to note some of our lead sponsors, which have been rolling on the slides as you've come in, but just to make sure to note the people that really help make this exhibition happen and allow the special exhibition to happen. Some of the lead sponsors: Ameriprise Financial, Columbia Threadneedle, Paul Allen Family Foundation, Broughton Mary Bishop, the Kinsman Foundation, Pat and Shruti Ritz, Nanny Warren, and the Swigert Warren Foundation, and Jim and Susan Winkler. So a huge thank you to them for being able to sponsor this exhibition. And many, many others. I think one of the great things about an exhibition like this and others that we do is that it gets really broad-based support. So there's so many people who are involved in making this happen. So thank you to everyone. So just a couple program notes, but today's conversation, we're fortunate to be joined by Dina Dart, Curator of Native American Art, Julia Dolan, Minor White Curator of Photography, and Steve Graff, curator at the Maryhill Museum of Art, who has agreed to come and moderate the conversation. So a huge thank you to Steve, who I'll turn it over to here shortly. But I want to make a remark about a couple upcoming programs we have, since this is the kickoff of what we have an extended series of great educational programs, and being the director of education, I always find it my responsibility when I'm in front of a group to make sure you know about some of those programs. So today's program is really focused on sort of the curatorial perspective of really bringing this exhibition together and thinking really carefully in a complex way about Edward Curtis and the three contemporary photographers, Wendy Red Star, Zig Jackson, and Will Wilson, who have also added their voice and amazing perspectives to this exhibition. We will also have additional programs that will feature each of those artists on separate dates starting in March. So Wendy Red Star, Zig Jackson, and Will Wilson will give their own artist talks beginning in March and extending into April. So make sure to check the website and different program information about those dates. Those will be incredibly important programs to attend. Will Wilson is also going to be here April 9th with his Critical Indigenous Photographic Exchange project. And when you see some of the work up in the exhibition, you'll make a greater connection with that project. So you'll be able to see that in process, which is going to be incredible. We also have an exciting sort of little bit of a change of pace with the 1491s coming and doing a performance here in April. They are a Native American comedy troupe, sketch comedy troupe. And it's going to be a great way to sort of really amp up the sense of humor that I think you'll see in some of the work that you see in the exhibition. It's a really important element to add to these critical issues. So we'll see them. And then finally, and these are just among many programs, we have been partnering with Portland State University to do a series we called In Dialogue. And that is a series of programs that really brings people in conversation with different leading community thinkers around these issues here at the museum, and gives a chance for there to be a real conversation. We have a lot of programs where you hear from experts, curators, artists, but we want to make sure we've got a chance for us to really get into the meat of some of these complex issues. So you can see more information on our website about some of the great speakers that we'll have facilitating these community-based conversations for this exhibition. Before I turn it over to Steve, just sort of a quick personal note. It's been a real honor and privilege for me to be able to work with Julia, Dina, and everybody who's worked on this incredible exhibition. And I know one thing that's a definite fact is the exhibition that you see over in the galleries, which is a tremendous effort, would not be possible without that incredible sort of combo team of Julia and Dina bringing their curatorial superpowers together to make this possible. So I want to give a special thanks to them for working on this incredible exhibition. And let's get this rolling. I'm going to turn it over to Steve and welcome up Steve Graff, Julia Dolan, and Dina Dart.
Thank you all for coming. and we're going to get right to it. We will be done in time. For those of you who have not had an opportunity to see the exhibit yet, there should be time between when we finish here and when the museum closes so that you can get over there. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. So, let's start at the beginning. What was the original impetus for creating this exhibition? And Julie, I'll let you start.
Do you have the forward motion?
I just remembered.
Thank you. I'll just speak very briefly. This is one of the part of the impetus of this exhibition is the fact that we are very fortunate as an institution to own a full set of Edward Sheriff Curtis's The North American Indian, which was produced between 1907 and 1930. And there are only so many institutions that have a full set. There were approximately, people are still a little fuzzy on the numbers, maybe about 222 full sets ever completed, even though Curtis and his first funder, J.P. Morgan, wanted 500 full sets to be completed. So you can probably imagine having an object like this that took 23 years in total to create, only 200 some odd sets were made. The fact that we still have a full set is really quite something. And we were very lucky that Henrietta E. Failing, who was the daughter of one of the founders of the museum, Henry Failing, purchased the set as it was being released. So there was a call that went out to say, we're going to be putting this into production, and Curtis originally thought it was going to be 5 years. It ended up being 23. For the price of $3,000, you will have 20 volumes bound plus 20 volumes of prints of loose images. And so she purchased the subscription before 1907, and as each book was released and as each portfolio was released, they immediately came to the museum on loan. The museum had a library at that point. So since 1907, everything came to the museum and rested here, and then the gift was given to us in its entirety through her estate after her death in 1931. So that was one of the main reasons that we knew that we could do an exhibition, because we have the resources at hand to work carefully and thoughtfully and in some ways, in many ways, critically with this body of work, because we have the ability to do the research right here.
Julia and I had probably about a year before Brian approached us, we had talked about the possibility of bringing it out, and actually we talked about digitizing it to make it accessible to the public, as well as bringing it out and combining our voices. And about a year later, with the importance of or the popularity of the short nights of the Shadow Catcher. Can we see how many people in the room have, yeah, right. And so Brian was being approached, we were being approached about our set. People really wanted to see it. You know, people were learning about Edward Sheriff Curtis and wanting to see it. And when we sat down and started talking about it, we agreed it's a very valuable resource. It's an incredible body of work, and if we show it, we need to show it alongside living Native artists so that we can dive in critically and really sort of unpack some of the issues that Native American and non-Native scholars have been addressing in academic scholarship, historians, anthropologists, art historians, for the last 20 years or so. So this was a great opportunity.
Can you give sort of for those who have not seen the exhibit, give them an overview of what they're going to see, and for those of us who have, maybe a little bit more of an in-depth description of what's there?
Yeah, so as you enter into the first main gallery, you'll see the Edward Curtis, the volumes, and some of the portfolio images on the walls. You'll also see the work of these contemporary Native photographers. So Zig Jackson, whose work is really in direct dialogue with Curtis's, we have interspersed throughout. And then Wendy Red Star and Will Wilson have spaces where they're grappling with those issues as well as addressing some of their own art practice. And we've grouped the Curtises in these what we're calling critical pauses, in sections of the work that have been critiqued or make up a certain trope, if you will, such as the vanishing race and the posing of the primitive and so on. We'll go into those in just a moment. And then we've also got 3 visitor feedback stations so that the audience, the visitor to the exhibition, can also participate in this dialogue. So the visitor feels like they also have a voice in grappling with this legacy of Edward S. Curtis.
Julia?
This is an example of one of the areas we're calling a critical pause, and you'll see this one in what we sort of deem the first room of the exhibition. But there are approximately 10 images that I chose in order to discuss this idea of the vanishing race, which, if you look at the top left image, that is the title of the image. It's The Vanishing Race, Navajo. The term vanishing race was not something that Curtis invented. It was something that was really in the ether at the time that he was making his photographs, because the Native American culture was being pushed out systematically by the US government, and lands were being reduced, and so on and so forth. The concept of the vanishing race was known in many circles throughout the United States. So I try to unpack some of that to a certain extent in terms of the types of imagery that Curtis was making to suggest this idea of the vanishing race and what that actually means. And the type of photography that Curtis was making was known as pictorialist. And what you see here are these beautiful, rich amber tones of a photogravure, and they're kind of inky because it is a print process. Even though it's photographically based, it's a print process, and it's very painterly, and it's often very romantic. So this idea of this vanishing, of this saying goodbye to the past in order to move to more of a sort of Western European modern future, is very well done in the sepia tones of the photogravure. So if you look at this selection of works, you will see that they're very sort of heavily inked and deep, and they're deep, dark shadows of valleys and mountains, and individuals are walking away from the camera and into the distance. So we are, instead of sort of confronting us and looking at us as viewers and holding the space, they're moving out of the space, which is now, if you will, ours. In the present and the future. So that's one of the critical pauses. Within that space, within the first exhibition, there are a couple of critical pauses, but then we also have works by Zig Jackson. And it was really important for us to not push. I know, it's good that you laugh. That's good. Zig likes that. It's okay to laugh. Because truths can be found through humor. It was important for us to not relegate the contemporary artists to the back of the room, because that oftentimes happens. There's this impetus sometimes to perhaps work chronologically, because oftentimes that's how we learn, and we're used to structuring our learning chronologically. So the oldest material comes first, the newest comes last. But that has an effect on our understanding too, and our perhaps understanding of what's important. So when you go into each room, you will see, for the most part, a mix. And Zig is so beautifully interactive with Edward Curtis's work, because he is interested in the act of photographing others and what that means, and what kind of power relationships occur within the space of photography. So he's such a great underpinning. And so his series, Indian Photographing Tourist, Photographing Indian, is just remarkable, because, and the wording is so critical as well. It's not just the images. We can look at this image and maybe get a sense of what's going on. But Zig, through his titling, is saying to us, I'm Native American. I am now photographing you, a tourist, photographing other Native Americans. Would you look at yourself already, right? And it's such a wonderful thing for somebody who studies photography all the time, because I am really concerned about the ways that people go to other societies or look at people who are not like them, take a photograph of them, remove that photograph from where they made it, take it away from the person who is the subject of the photograph, and then disseminate it. So Curtis was disseminating through a massive volume of works that went to universities and libraries and people of means. These volumes did not come back to Native American communities. We're doing that at the same time today in some of the same ways, where we're taking our digital cameras to different places, photographing people who don't look like us, and then posting them on Facebook and Instagram and so on and so forth. So if there's any way for people to see what Zig is doing and start thinking about their own photographic processes, that will make me very, very happy.
Dina?
So also in that first space, one of the primary critiques of the Curtis work has been that when he traveled to, there were primarily reservations that he was traveling out to between 1907 and 1930. The people that he found weren't necessarily, or how he found the people wasn't necessarily how he photographed them. So at the same time that he was traveling out to these reservations, he was needing to raise money, and so the vanishing, the more urgency that was created around the loss of traditional life ways and traditional cultures, and really putting forward this idea of vanishing, the more fundable the project was, right? And so we need to remember, and another thing that we've been talking about for the 18 months that we've been planning this exhibition is that we don't mean to demonize Curtis. The reality is that he was working within a set of societal ideas, and he was also an artist trying to, we know that in order to make art, you have to support yourself, and the truth is it required a lot of support for the travel and the support of the ethnographers that he was bringing out to the communities as well. So that's a piece of it, that it was important for him to create this idea of a pre-contact Native life that was vanishing. And many of the people that were traveling out to Native communities at that time, they wanted to capture a pre-contact Native life. They wanted to capture the primitive. And so Curtis too, even at he went to great lengths to create a sense of a primitive people. And in many cases, you wouldn't see a hunter any longer hunting without clothing on the reservation. You probably wouldn't see this. By 1930, you certainly wouldn't see this. You'd see many men in their Levi's and cotton shirts, maybe still hunting, but looking like the rest of modern America, right? So this is one of the critical pauses, or one of the areas that we try to unpack and have people think about what might have really been going on in the 20s and 30s, or the teens and 20s, when he was traveling out to these communities. There were probably cars parked in the parking lot just adjacent to this man standing on the rock, is what I'm... And in fact, when we first started planning, I started posting some of these images on Facebook and asking, I have about 500 Native friends on Facebook, and asking, do any of you know who this person is? He's not named in the Curtis work, and I'm trying to name him. There were people that sent me photographs of the same area that had hotels and buildings on the shore over here, right? But Curtis cropped this edge and the canoe and the single person when there were hordes of people on the beach over to the left. So at the same time that there were policies, there were U.S. federal policies to eliminate some of these traditional practices, certainly to put a stop to ceremonial practices on reservations, and and children were being moved to boarding schools and forbidden to speak their native languages and not allowed to wear their traditional clothing. The policy was eradicating these practices at the same time that these ethnographers and people like Curtis were trying to capture them. Wendy's work is just on the other side of that first gallery, and Wendy's work deals with those issues beautifully, because in all of the imagery in her space are these strong Crow women in traditional dress, having not lost their cultural traditions, and are very much a presence on the Crow reservation. And I won't go into detail about what's happening in Wendy's space, because she'll speak for herself in an artist talk, but she has really sort of reinvigorated the Curtis work with color and with femininity. Curtis was known to photograph only men in the big portraits, and usually high status men. And so Wendy has put in some nice big portraits of Crow women in her space, and so in many ways contradicting the ideas that Curtis was trying to put forward by creating that artifice.
Julia?
Just to show you an example of a couple of the other critical pauses, here we have material culture and architecture. Something that happens with Curtis is, as time goes on and certain images are favored over others, we lose sight of the full package, if you will, that is the North American Indian. And actually in the first room, we show you examples within the books that are not photographic, because it's so easy to go to the 2,200 plus images and, wow, this photographic work is amazing, and it is. But he, at any given time, had 17 or 18 staff members with him doing incredible amounts of work when he wasn't able to be there to necessarily take all of the information and do the ethnographic research. He had other people doing some of that research and writing for him, plus photographic assistants and salesmen and so on, translators and guides and so on. But as time has moved on, and here we are 100 years later, we tend to see particular portraits of particular men and women from various tribes from the North American Indian. But he really did photograph and do so much more in this work, so we pull that out between the material culture and the architecture. And oftentimes, any of the architectural photographs that we see tend to be the more traditional structures, and there were many individuals who were living in wood homes or brick and so on. So we try to push that in the exhibition too, to say, well, don't just assume that everything looked one way or Curtis was ignoring diversity amongst cultures. He does try to pull out that diversity. When you look at some of the images that are material culture, certainly the way that the images are tailored is for a more kind of mainstream Western European audience, right? And even the portraits do that too. There's a certain visual language of photography at the time that most people who would be receiving these images would understand and appreciate. So he models his still lives just like he models his people. So it's nice to keep that in mind as well. But it's wonderful reference points, and something that I do like about the work, if you take a look at the top right image of the baskets, that's an image that he made of modern designs in basketry, and then from the same tribe, he took a photograph of baskets that have traditional designs in them. So he's not necessarily ignoring the modern. Oftentimes we forget that because there's just so much to look at in Curtis. We sometimes ignore the modern.
Dina?
Another one of the common practices at the turn of the century was to travel out to Native communities and gather data, gather images of material culture, images of architecture, images of the people, the representative people. And this is another sort of subsection of the Curtis work. There are, for each of the groups that he visited, there is a representative phenotype or a face that is meant to represent that community. The interesting thing is shown together. They're just people. And so this notion, it fits into the time very well, right? The notion of a social hierarchy or a social Darwinism that was being promoted at World's Fairs, and it was still really a common understanding among most academics in the early 1900s that brown people were essentially a lesser people and could be typed. And so not to say that Curtis was meaning to perpetuate any kind of racist stereotypes. He was working within a set of ideas. But what has been important in doing this work is just to call out some of those things and not to continue to consume these images and their titles on face value, but to rather look at them in the time in which they were created, and also to look at, one of the important things has been that the way that pop culture has mined this body of work and perpetuated some of these ideas that are so pervasive today about stereotypes, and certainly this body of work. If you do a Google image search, you'll get a grid of images, and 80% of them will be Curtis images. And most of them will be men, and feather war-bottomed men, but oftentimes they will be, they'll fit into these stereotypes, and that's how this material and these ideas are perpetuated forward. Will Wilson really speaks to, in this particular set, Critical Indigenous Photographic Exchange, which will be doing here on April 9th, it speaks to the idea of reciprocity, and in that speaks directly to Curtis's process, in that, as Julia mentioned, these volumes went to people of means and museums and universities, and never went to the communities. So in Will's Critical Indigenous Photographic Exchange, he literally hands he uses the box format camera, much like the one that Curtis used, and he creates a tintype on site, and then literally hands the original tintype to the sitter so that they have control over their image. And this is in direct response to the fact that these images left the reservation and often didn't come back, right, until Native people went and sought them out. All Native, every Native family I know has Curtis images in their homes now, because the reprints of them are available everywhere. But so Will's work speaks directly to this idea of reciprocity in the Sipek's work. So one of the critical pauses that we felt was important to pull out was the way that the material has been used in pop culture and the film industry. How many of you recognize the image on the left? At least a handful, a couple handfuls, right? So that's Two Whistles. He's a Crow medicine person who was the inspiration for Johnny Depp's character in the most recent version of The Lone Ranger and Tonto. And so in this way, this beautiful body of work and all of this rich data about Native American people has been used in these rather obscure ways, and ways that also perpetuate stereotypes. The image at the top is Cha'ist. She's a high-status Chinook woman from Willapa Bay, and she is shown several times on the Chinook Nation website as a sign of longevity in this place, as the Chinook Nation fights for sovereign status. They utilize the Curtis images and Chi'ist in particular because she is an important person and represents Chinook identity. And then Harold Meeks on the right is shown in the title is Klamath Warrior Headdress, but I'm told by some of the Klamath folks that I know that it's just a traditional Klamath hat. Everybody wore one like this, but in conversations with many of my Klamath friends, I was told who this man is, and a friend of mine has actually brought back the traditional Klamath hat by using this image. So in many ways, these images are being mined now by Native people for the ethnographic content, the rich content that exists in that body of work. We see near the end of the 27 years that Curtis was working, near the end, there's many more images that show signs of modernity. People in modern clothing, people named on their portraits, including the gentleman on the left who, in California and in the Southwest, people had intermarried with folks from further south and had Spanish surnames. Many of them had Spanish surnames. He didn't do anything to hide that ethnic mixture. He rarely tried to create that sense of the primitive or the vanishing any longer. So he photographed groups and groups with signs of modern life all around them. And in the one on the lower left, you see that's actually his boat, the boat that he traveled to Alaska in. And so you see in the volumes more of a sense of authentic Indian life of the times. Is that mine too? So one of the things that we try to do in keeping with the museum thinking internationally is to have the visitors respond and enter into dialogue with us. So rather than the museum continuing to be sort of the ivory tower that speaks the truth, from the museum with a capital M, we've tried to be transparent about who's speaking in our text panels. The text panels that Julia wrote have her name at the bottom, and the ones that I've written have my name at the bottom. And then we've got these response stations so that you all can participate in the dialogue as well. And so there are places throughout to encourage people to think critically about these ideas and to leave their responses and be in dialogue with people who come after them. So there's one in that main gallery space around the idea of vanishing. So we presented a quote from Edward Curtis that speaks directly to this idea that Indians are headed toward an unknown future. And asking people to respond to that. And then in two other areas in the gallery, we're asking for people to engage.
So now that we sort of have an introduction to the exhibition, I'll have you both respond to the question. We'll start with Julia, since your voice must be a little tired. Why is this exhibition important to the Portland Art Museum's mission, and why is it being shown now in 2016?
I would think that Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher had a lot to do with why now, because I had at least one book club come to visit the museum to have a look at some of the original volumes and prints of Edward Curtis as the North American Indian, because they had read Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher. And people were asking Brian, if say he'd read it, or and I believe at a meeting it was really only about a year ago. We've been it went pretty quickly. We planned for just a bit over a year. Brian asked us about Edward Curtis, because I'm quite certain that other people were asking him about it, because it's back up. It's in sort of the hive mind, if you will. It was a book that was a New York Times bestseller. I'm glad that even though we got the exhibition together rather quickly, it might seem like a year is a long time. It's not a long time in museum exhibition production. But I'm glad that we did, and we're doing it in 2016, because Edward Curtis's 150th birthday is in 2018, and multiple museums are planning on exhibitions. So we got in a little under the wire there, which makes me happy to start off the conversation. And I think something that was important to us, though, because we do so many things, we want to show beautiful work, we want to show fascinating work, we want to show critically important work, but we also want our visitors to think beyond the image and think about the responsibilities that those images bear. And that's something that I think we in Portland are often very good at doing. It doesn't always feel good, because bringing up someone like Edward Curtis and questioning certain aspects of the work that he did isn't always pleasant. It doesn't necessarily feel good to go below the surface of a beautiful pictorial image and pick it apart and figure out how it makes the people who were portrayed feel, or what is the legacy of this type of work, and what about these moments in our history as a country that make us uncomfortable. But I think as a museum, we do try to do that whenever possible for the benefit of our visitors. And I know it also benefits me as a curator. I don't know everything. I'm constantly learning. So it's been a wonderful experience for me to learn an incredible amount from the various individuals who have participated in this exhibition.
Yeah, in addition to Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher, there's just a buzz around Native American appropriation, and there's more activity than I've ever seen around the sort of taking to task the Washington Redskins, for instance. There's more of that kind of activism than I've ever seen, and it might have everything to do with social media. It might have to do with the fact that I have 500 Native American friends on social media, so I see it a lot. But it's really striking, the amount of sort of indigenous empowerment and the taking back of the narrative that is occurring right now. And it's happening in museums nationally. And we are sort of riding that wave as well. And in the summer, we're hosting an exhibition of Native American fashion, and next year we're we're curating a big exhibition of Tlingit art, and all of that is very timely. We have more of an audience now than ever before. Look at the size of this group, and I mean that attests to if we had had this exhibition maybe 15 years ago, we wouldn't have had it wouldn't be as popular. A lot of people are exposed to these ideas in ways that they haven't been in the past, I think.
Julia, as a photo historian, where does Edward S. Curtis sort of fit in that academic arc of 19th, 20th century photographers?
Oh, he's a fascinating character. And he's a complex one, and he's a man of his time. And I don't want to take too much time on this question. It's a great question, and the only reason I say that is because I'll be speaking in 3 weeks about Edward Curtis specifically and where he fits into photography within his time period, in particular between 1907 and 1930. But yeah, it's fascinating because we see him in some ways trapped in a type of trove. He's trapped in pictorialism when actually the photographic world is moving on and moving past pictorialism into modernism. And at the same time, so he's using this sort of older way of making photography look like art, while at the same time using cutting edge moving picture technology as early as about 1904, 1906, and then he does In the Land of the Headhunters in approximately 1914. So he's really balancing back and forth between an older way of expression through photography and newer ways of photographic media. He's trapped in between. So again, I'll talk about that later. But I think it's helpful to place him within the larger space of other photographers as well, because so often he seems very godlike, I think, in a number of books that I've read, in particular Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher, and I think we have to be really careful to remember that he is a human being. Manically kind of productive, certainly, but he is a human being and he is of his time, so that's something we'll be able to flesh out in a couple of weeks.
Has the academic community's opinion of him changed, say, in the last half century?
Well, I'd say a half century ago, not too many people were paying attention to him. What's really interesting about the North American Indian is that by the time it was completed with its 20th volume in 1930, the love of the romance of the vanishing race had really dissipated. We've moved through a world war. We're now in the machine age and new technological age. And modernity has swept its way through, and it feels like most Native Americans are on their reservations and they've been squelched to a certain extent. So it wasn't at the top of mind for many people. And Curtis was no longer really paid attention to because people weren't interested in pictorialist photography anymore. They're looking at photographs more and more in magazines and the print media, and they're much more interested in, again, a cleaner kind of modern type of photography. So that mothballed him for a good 40 years, and it really wasn't until the 1970s or so that he starts coming back to the fore. An interest in something, and that's very true of the time of the 60s and 70s, finding these quote-unquote lost photographers, because photography really wasn't considered a fine art media by the market until the 1960s and 70s, only in little pockets before that. So, he has this revival, and there are other social forces like the environmental movement and so on who are very interested in these types of images. And then he gets, the academics get a hold of him by the 80s and the 90s when I was in graduate school, and the pendulum just swung completely the other way, because academics were very, very concerned about deconstructing what history was. Whose history is it? Whose voice is telling that history? So it was necessary to pull down and deconstruct somebody like Edward Curtis. So he was really, in some ways, vilified by the time I was in graduate school. But things, that's the thing about spectrums and the pendulum, and things tend to oftentimes come back to center. We react in one direction and we react too far in another direction. And now people are very much interested in, again, treating him as a human being, not as a god and not as a villain, but as a human being who did amazing but problematic work. And it's great for me to be in that place now where I like being in the muck of photography. It's not interesting to me unless it's a little bit mucky and complicated. I love beautiful photographs, but I'm more interested in the ones that are, that have teeth to them. So it's a great time to be a photo historian.
How do you feel that photographs by other photographers of the same time period, but also of Native subjects, how do you feel like his work differs from theirs? And I'm thinking, for instance, of the stray amateur photographer who might be an Indian agency employee, or somebody who ran a photo studio in a single town for 30 years and had people coming through his door.
Hundreds of people who are not Native American have photographed Native Americans, if not thousands, certainly. Over time, but if we're talking about his time period, it's probably in the hundreds. Curtis's are a lot prettier most of the time. They're really beautiful and they're romantic. You cannot take that away from him. He's an artist. He's an amateur ethnographer, but he's not an ethnographer, right? Specifically. And so photography is the camera is being used as a tool to gather information. And Curtis is straddling this line of being an artist and gathering in information at the same time. So he kind of goes back and forth. It's a really complex dance that he is successful at in some ways and not necessarily successful at in others. But it's so interesting. I was thinking about this question. We were lucky we got the questions beforehand so we could do a little research. But even somebody like Timothy O'Sullivan was photographing back in the 1870s Native Americans. We think of him about photographing these amazing Western landscapes, but he was photographing Native Americans too. And I was just stunned to see that 30 years before Curtis was even starting, O'Sullivan was photographing Native Americans who were wearing denim and cotton shirts. And 30 years later, Curtis is pulling people back to look more romantically, closer to the earth, more natural, if you will, what they did in the past. That wasn't necessarily reality. So it's such a complex thing. But for the most part, the people who are photographing Native Americans are not Native American. And you had brought up Horace Pulaw, certainly, which is wonderful. Someone who's photographing later, really, 1920s to 1950s. And it feels more, I'm trying to think of the word. I don't want to say real, because the word real is so complicated when you're dealing with a medium like photography. But it feels more right. It feels more what life was probably like, because he was living that life. And these were people that he knew, and he was displaying a side perhaps of Native American culture that someone like Curtis, who was not of Native American culture, who was an outsider, even though he was often very beloved by many of people he photographed, he's still an outsider. And he had a job to do, and it wasn't the same job as Pulaw. So many people take these images, and there are other people. Frank Reinhardt in Nebraska makes these amazing studio images. They're absolutely beautiful, but it's just, it's so, and actually I really love it because he would use the same backdrops that he would use for white people. And I love that. Instead of making it maybe something it's not. It's his studio. He's not making it something other than what it is. But you get these moments of, I don't want to necessarily say friction, but it's like reality kind of skips and jumps a little bit. And you start wondering, well, where is the reality here? And can photography ever even really capture that anyway?
Well, speaking of reality, how do you feel about the comment that photos don't lie? And how would you relate that to then the Curtis works?
I do have an answer for that, and I want to say I did not ask him to ask me this question, but I love that you came up with the photographs don't lie, because I spent a lot of my academic career working on Lewis Hines photographs. Those of you who might sound familiar, here's the one who photographed at Ellis Island. He photographed for the National Child Labor Committee, so all those child labor images. He also photographed the Empire State Building as it was under construction, so you probably know those. And one time, Lewis Hine wrote, "Photographs don't lie, but liars photograph." And that says it all, right? There's this one-to-one relationship with reality when we have a photograph. That's what I think is so magnificent and exciting about it. But whose reality is it? And can you ever really convey that, in particular about another human being? Maybe you can get to a certain extent of it through the housing and the baskets, or material culture. But when you're trying to capture the quote-unquote essence of another human being, is that ever really possible? And so there's so much artifice that goes into photography. So it might be an index of the world that's right in front of you, and that person, that object, this chair is sitting here in this space and in this time, and I take a photograph of it so it's real. But to whom and how? And we all read these images differently, so we could do a seminar on it.
Thank you. So Dina, we know well, or we will after Julia gives her lecture, we have a sense of how the academic photography community feels. What's your sense of how the native art, the native anthropology communities feel about the Curtis images?
Well, it's interesting, but while we've been talking the entire time about showing the diversity of Indian country, and that Curtis recognized the diversity of Indian country, although the way that the set of images has been used doesn't really convey that. I think that question also reflects the diversity of Indian country. So there seems to be opinions on the whole spectrum. So there are people, and I for a long time was a Curtis hater, because I was a student of anthropology, and I recognized the the opportunity that he had to expose what was happening on the reservations and didn't. He saw himself as an activist and a voice for Native people, but then the work ends up being very passive, right, and not a tool to bring information to the people, because it probably wouldn't have sold, right? And he may have been pushed to finish much sooner. I don't know, but so. In speaking with the artists themselves, 3 artists, all 3 have different ideas about Curtis and the role he played, and the role the work continues to play. And we spoke with one of the artists who said, if the people were giving him that information and allowing him to photograph ceremony, then he must have earned the trust of the people. And then another one of the artists said he should never have photographed those things, and I'm not sure how he got permission to photograph those things, and therefore those images shouldn't be shown. And so, there's no one answer. They're just as diverse as Indian country is. The answers are just as diverse.
Is your sense that Native communities, as a rule, have had access to the Curtis work, or is that more a recent phenomenon?
It sounds to me, and I learned this through the process of curating this show, that people have had images. They weren't generally the photogravures, they weren't these big, beautiful prints, but many of the individuals that were photographed were given a cyanotype, were given, proofs. And one of the speakers at our reception, Charles Hudson, his family actually has 5 or 6 of the images of a longtime dog, his great-grandfather, who was photographed by Curtis. So there were more in circulation than we knew. Certainly the volumes and the portfolios were not accessible until, I don't know, maybe the last 30, 40 years. But as I said, I don't know a single Native family that doesn't have copies of Curtis images that show their cultures. I know where I come from, all of the families have the set of images from the California volume. So
there's a discussion in the exhibition, and it's been alluded to here, that Curtis's ideas about his Native subjects changed over time, and I'm wondering if you can just give us a couple of sort of examples of where you could see that was the case.
Well, early on, I think that he really did believe that that it was an inevitable future that Native people were going to perish, or at least that cultural traditions were perishing, and it was inevitable that that Native people would lose their cultural traditions. And spending 23 years visiting those communities, I think that he came to understand that many of those cultural traditions weren't disappearing. And but I think that the later volumes, it may have to do with the communities that he was visiting and how often or how many times he had been there. But you see people smiling. You see a shift in the sitter. You see a shift in the content. And I'd like to think that is the pictorial representation of a shift in his consciousness. Somebody said in the first patron event, I mentioned that, and one of the patrons said, maybe he was just tired. Maybe he was just tired of trying to create the artifice, and so he just wanted to finish. And maybe so. But I think that you can see the shift in the people's faces too. Like there's a certain familiar sense, and many of the people I've talked to too have these really lovely stories of his time in their communities. So. It sounds like he was pretty well loved among a lot of communities.
So if we make the assumption, at least, that a part of his work is romantic, what do you see as the danger for the mainstream society having a romantic stereotype of what are now contemporary peoples?
I think that when Curtis is taken at face value, when the Curtis work, and this image is a perfect example, right, of the ones that we see most commonly in the media, then those stereotypes stay entrenched. The danger is that mascots can continue to exist if this is a noble portrayal of an Indian person. Then why can't we use it? Well, because this doesn't portray all Native people, for one, and I mean that's a big one, right? There are. And he, his work actually tried to show the diversity of Indian country, but even 80 groups is not representative of what we have. We have over 562 federally recognized groups and hundreds of others that are small, communities throughout the country, and then First Nations and Mexico. The diversity that exists is vast, and we no longer, we only wear regalia for special occasions. Some of us don't, I don't dress in regalia ever, right? We're, again, everywhere on the spectrum, and we need to be able, Native people need to be met where we are as modern people, as representatives of our individual nations, and these images freeze people's idea in this ethnographic snapshot in time. It's really problematic.
Well, speaking of that problem, can we say at least aspects of Curtis' career reflect the fact that he was enjoying white privilege and perhaps perpetuating a colonial mindset?
We can say that, Steve. But I'm glad you did.
That wasn't that wasn't a yes/no question.
Absolutely. And this is a sign of the times that we've got 3 contemporary Native photographers who are showing their work in that space. So it's not a Curtis exhibition. It's an exhibition of Native American contemporary photographers in dialogue with this romanticized collection of work. But yes, thank you.
So I'm going to give both of you an opportunity to briefly talk about the three other photographers that didn't exhibit, and perhaps from your points of view, you can tell us why they were selected to be included, and really specifically what they bring to the discussion that's there in the gallery. And Julia, I'll let you go first.
I suggested Zig Jackson, again, because of his understanding of the photographic medium and the inherent problems of representing others through a photograph. He's a fascinating fellow. I've noted that Zig's in his 50s, Will's in his 40s, and Wendy's in her 30s. So we have some decade difference there too, which is really, I think, important too, because he's coming out making photographs at a time earlier than perhaps Will and Wendy. And again, he's on the sort of, I don't want to say leading edge, but almost the leading edge of when photography is accepted now as an art form, but it's much more theoretical than the first photographs that were considered artistic, like Ansel Adams and Edward Weston and so on. So he's at this cutting edge of being theoretical with his photography, which is wonderful. He's also, he was the first Native American whose photographs were accepted into the Library of Congress, and that happened in the year 2000. It was only 15 years ago. So Library of Congress has plenty of photographs of Native Americans, but he was the first Native American whose photographs were officially accessioned by them. So he's someone who has this wonderful, again, this history of the understanding of the underpinnings of photography. So he was important for me to add.
Yeah, and I would just add about Zig too that Zig has a pretty critical approach. You know, he comes out of a period when American Indian movement and Red Power movement, like a very sort of critical and hard-hitting set of ideas in his work, and so he's very much part of the critique. And then go ahead and then I see Wendy and Will as really part of the response, part of the, okay, so this is what has occurred, and now this is what we're going to contribute. This is the direction that we're going, and so yeah, I had already spoken a little bit to Wendy's, but. Her the feminine, the gender issues, and the sort of restoring radiance, restoring the feminine side to the portrayal of Native people. Go ahead.
And I'll just briefly say, because I know we're running out of time, I'd like to acknowledge that Wendy Red Star is here in the room with us, which is fantastic, and. Will and Zig are on airplanes home because they have to teach. So they couldn't stay for today, unfortunately. And Wendy, because we only had so much room in the title, like the amount of angst that goes into titling a show. So we call it Contemporary Native Photographers, but I think that Wendy would consider herself an artist who uses photography in her practice. But perhaps she can talk about that when she speaks. But we love having Wendy in our community, and it's wonderful for us to be able to work with her on site here. And then Will Wilson, I knew of his work certainly, but I believe Dina had suggested that we bring him in, and it is really wonderful to have him, in particular because of his direct dialogue with the issues of reciprocity between leaving a photograph behind or just taking the information and going, so.
We had just acquired, right as we started planning this exhibition, we had just acquired a work by Wendy also, where she literally, she was in literal dialogue with these historic images by writing on them and restoring cultural knowledge to these photographs that have taken on a life of their own out in the realm of pop culture. And Julia and I had just acquired that set. And so anyways, we had those images in our mind right away when we started talking about this show. And so Wendy was the first one that we thought about. Yeah, and Will talks also about, his homelands. So Curtis was photographing in, Native homelands. Will looks at how these homelands that are, they're federal lands held in trust by Native people are being exploited for the natural resources, and pollution is a huge issue in Deneta, in Navajo country, and so that's another important piece, is the land and the homelands of these people who were photographed and how those have changed over time as well.
So during the course of this project, how have your opinions of Curtis's work changed, negatively or positively? And were there any real moments where you felt like you experienced a big surprise when you learned something new? So, Julia, I'll let you start.
I have so many feelings about Edward Curtis, and they kind of run the gamut. I'm grateful that he did what he did. I really am. I'm grateful that the works have survived so that we can talk about them today. I'm glad we live in an era where we don't have to see necessarily one side or the other, but can delve pretty deeply into them and have open, if difficult, discussions about the work. I do respect him in ways that I didn't before. I was very respectful of the amount of work he did, tens of thousands of photographs, over 25 years, but I always had kind of questioned that outsider view. But I really appreciate having read some of his letters and some information that he puts within the later volumes, that he gets angrier and angrier as time goes on, and disgusted with the way that these human beings were treated and how their lands were taken. So I am grateful to him for that as well. And if we can move that part of his understanding of his own process forward, I think that would be great for his legacy.
Yeah, I can't say that I feel warm and fuzzy toward him, but I certainly do. I read Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher, and I also recognize that, like the viewpoint that Curtis took, the sort of the perspective and the stance that Curtis took, Timothy Egan also took, right? And he did feel warm and fuzzy about Curtis, and that really comes across in the book. And but I do have a greater respect for the person in that. So many of the Native people that I've spoken to over the last year have these really lovely stories of his time with them, including Chuck Williams, who's here in the audience, who speaks about, him being a really generous person, and who wrote about, was the first person who wrote about Chief Tumwater, who was hung by Phil Sheridan's army. Curtis was the first person to take the family's side in his writings. And so he was really an activist. He was really somebody who was advocating for Native rights. And my perspective prior to working on this had always been, he could have done more. He should have done more. He should have exposed what was going on. He was one man, and I learn on a daily basis that that I can't do more than one person can do. And so, yeah, I've developed a level of respect that I didn't have prior to this.
So with an exhibition that features the very different work of 4 photographers, what are some of the big ideas you hope that the public will take away when they leave?
For me as a whole, and to not call any one artist in the exhibition out, and I mentioned this earlier, if I can get a certain number of people to think about their own images, the images that they make, the images that they make of other people in other places, and think about the responsibilities that they bear when doing so, not even necessarily that if it will change their behavior, but to have people think more critically about the act of making a photograph and the potential ramifications of transmitting an image, in particular of another person, then I do feel like I've done my job.
As obvious as this might sound to this particular audience, because you're interested enough to come today, believe it or not, there are many people who still speak about Native Americans in the past tense, speak about Native Americans in the singular, as if there's one Native American culture or the Native American. There are many people that come through the Native American galleries that have really stereotypical ideas, and not to fault any of them. We're a product of our culture, and Native Americans are almost entirely absent from the media and pop culture. So those things are. If people walk out of there knowing that there are living, working Native American artists working in all kinds of media, not only beadworkers and carvers, contemporary people, then I'll be happy, thrilled.
We're going to take a couple of questions in just a second, but before we do that, there's a somewhat well-known curatorial phenomenon that when your exhibit opens, you sometimes may have gone on to the next thing already. So I'd like to know, and give you an opportunity to know beforehand, what the both of you are working on that may show up here in the next year or two or even 3.
I haven't moved on yet, but I do have...
You're forgiven.
Thanks. I have an exhibition opening next month, March 26th, William Eggleston's photographs. Some of you might know his work. But one project that is in its infancy that I'm really excited about working on is I was able to acquire a set of approximately 130 photographs from an estate in North Portland, and they are some of the most beautiful studio portraits made between about 1865 and 1940 of middle-class African Americans. And it is very rare that we see African Americans portrayed at any given point in our history as middle class or upper middle class. And so I'm in discussions with an artist named Chun Lee, who just opened an exhibition in Toronto this weekend, who has collected something similar from the 1970s and 80s, Polaroids of middle-class African Americans. So with any luck, we'll be able to dovetail those two together and bring you something in the next couple of years.
That sounds amazing. We only work right down the hall from each other, and I had no idea. We've got some great things we're cooking up. So June 4th, we'll open Native American fashion. There are 70 plus designers showcased in this exhibition. It's coming from Salem. The Peabody Essex Museum curated it, and it's just phenomenal. There are over 100 works of haute couture fashion. It's exquisite, from gowns to headdresses and jewelry to streetwear, and it's fantastic. Wendy Red Star has a work in it that's actually part of the Portland Art Museum's permanent collection. So that's in June. Before that occurs, actually in March, we'll be rotating the brand new contemporary Native American art space on the third floor, Hoffman, highlighting Kaylee Spitzer, who's a student of Wilson's, and Demian Deneyaji, who's a Portland-based Dene artist. And they'll be looking at gender and sexuality and the intersections of race. And then also in March, I'll be transforming the third floor Hoffman into a more contemporary space to honor the work of Lillian Pitt and the people who have been mentors to her and inspirations to her, and then the people that she has mentored and inspired. So stay tuned, keep an eye on that third floor over the next few months. Great. Oh, and then Resilience, the Art of the Klingit, next fall, which is a two-floor exhibition with at least 250 objects, and that's going to travel nationally and hopefully internationally as well.
Thank you. We have time to take a couple of questions, and if you'll raise your hand, the microphone is over here and there.
And here.
So anyone who has a question for either of the curators?
Just a question. Julia referred to a Curtis lecture. Is that here?
Yes, that is here. So that's February 28th, which is is it 3 weeks from now? I barely know what day it is these days. It's 3 weeks from now, last Sunday in February. It'll be right here at 2 p.m., and it'll be about Curtis, during this time period.
I saw the exhibit by, I think her name is Martika.
Matika Wilbur.
562, I believe. Are you going to bring that here or any of that, or
We had initially, thank you, the question was, are we going to bring Matika Wilbur's project 562 to the Portland Art Museum? Matika Wilbur is a Swinomish, Coast Salish artist who is traveling around the country and photographing all 562 fairly recognized tribes. We talked about including Matika, and we invited her, but Matika has grown to feel very unsavory toward Curtis. Her work is in direct dialogue, right? She's trying to create a body of work that rivals his, that replaces his. And it's an ambitious and wonderful task, and Matika is a brilliant artist, but she doesn't want to be shown with Curtis any longer. And she really felt like, because the body of work is as large as it is, that she should be shown alone. And we were really committed to showing these other artists as well.
I'm curious to know from Dina if any of the people that you encountered with cyanotypes that had been given them by Curtis, if there was any sense of a collaboration on occasion between sitter and photographer, if there was any notion of self-presentation with regard to the staging of these photographs as maybe collaborations?
I don't have a lot of experience with people who have such rich stories about the act of sitting for him. Like Chuck's family has stories of him, their family members taking him down the river, and the interactions that they had. I haven't heard a lot about the act of the posing of the individual. The family who got up, were you at the reception?
Yes.
One of the families that got up, Charles Hudson and his two sons, who are the great-grandson and great-great-grandsons of Longtime Dog, they had a lot of information, but they didn't share anything about the specific, during the photographic. I imagine that there were people who asked if they could have a certain object, and I know that there was agency and Native people who wanted to be wearing a certain thing. It had to have happened, but I didn't encounter during the planning process any stories of those.
I would like to know what the relationship was between Winterton C. Curtis, who you have at your museum many baskets that he collected or his father collected at the Dalles years ago, and Edward Curtis. What is the connection between them, or is there no connection?
They share a surname. But other than, Winterton Curtis was, I think, a Congregationalist minister in the
That's
Dalles.
right,
Yeah.
that's right.
And yeah, Maryhill Museum has a couple hundred baskets that
I
he
know,
collected.
I know that.
But to my knowledge, there's no familial relationship.
Okay. I'd like to talk to you after this.
Yeah, grab me afterwards. I won't leave. Any other questions? Great. Thank you all very much for coming.